Anything else? Perfect. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for taking the time out to attend today's webinar, which is part of a programme of enhanced support around net zero being delivered for the social enterprise sector in Wales. This is being delivered as part of the Social Business Wales programme funded by Welsh Government. The Welsh Government Foundational Economy team have also funded the DTA Wales under the Backing Local Firms Fund to look at opportunities to enable short supply chain food procurement in the public sector. So procurement, social enterprise and net zero, how could and should and are they connected? So the Welsh public sector spends around 7 billion each year on procurement, and with 60% or more of an organisation's carbon footprint being locked up in the goods and services they procure. Creating sustainable supply chains are an important way forward towards net zero and decarbonisation. So, there we are. So today we're going to look at a number of different topics. Both myself and Louise are going to take turns in speaking. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about why must we change our ways. And then Louise is going to introduce the Social Partnership and Public Procurement Act of 2023. I'm then going to look a little bit about ways to get procurement ready and to open doors into procurement opportunities. And then Louise is going to come back in and talk around procurement in practice and give some examples. And then there'll be some time for questions at the end. Okay, so procurement, just to give some definitions, procurement is the process of sourcing and paying for goods and services. It's through commissioning and procurement that the governments and public bodies such as the NHS, local council, basically agree to contracts with others to provide goods and services. So this comes to the total of around £7 billion each year in Wales. And when I say the word commissioners, I'm actually meaning the buyers and decision makers that are basically running the procurement processes. So just to do a little bit of the jargon around net zero. So there are 3 types of emission sources when we talk about net zero. These are scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. There is a level of direct influence that an organisation can have, especially around scope 1 and 2. So if you look at the table in the bottom right corner, scope 1 emissions are basically the sort of company's fleet, any sort of fuel combustion and things that they do. Scope 2 emissions are the electricity and heat that that company purchases. But if you look at the scope 3 emissions, there's that whole long list, including purchased goods and services, but there's also business travel, employee commuting, waste disposal, etc., etc. Now, some of those an organisation will have control over, but obviously the way that their employees get to work in the morning and things, they actually have less influence over that. When it comes to purchased goods and services, this again, they are buying into a product, but actually there's been a whole process of creating that product, of getting it to where it needs to be, of storage. And then once that product has been used, there's a whole thing around disposal as well. So actually there's a lot to think about in terms of scope 3 emissions. So the importance of addressing the purchase goods and service element of scope 3 emissions is that it can actually account for around 60% of an organisation's total carbon footprint. So scope 3 emissions are supply chain activity. So whilst they arise from the organisation's demand from goods and services, actually it's something that they can't really control. These supply chains activities can be influenced, however, by the way that an organisation run those procurement processes. This can partly be through really proactive contract management. So the way that they specify the requirements to their suppliers, the way that they evaluate tenders, so actually making those decisions early on before they give out any contracts is really important, and setting very clear KPIs as to what they expect in terms of trying to drive down emissions. It's also a real opportunity through proactive contract management once that contract's been agreed, but also to try and incentivize innovation going forward, to try and so everybody can work together about reducing emissions. Measuring Scope 3 emissions is really difficult. There has been some work done by Welsh Government in the past, and this is something that has been knocking around for a few years. It's a sustainable risk assessment that should be used in all procurements over £25,000. But a new version was released about 3 years ago that asks questions about the procurement and what is actually being purchased, whether it be a service or a goods. Actually, they're asking questions through the lens of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, to make that person think about, is the procurement really necessary? Are there options to reuse or recycle or do something completely differently? And if it does have to come down to a purchase at the end of the day, what can we think about that's going to help reduce emissions? So can we look for known accreditation, environmental standard or accreditation? Can we think about the raw materials that are being used and any key issues? So if it's a process that's being driven by fossil fuels, for example, also thinking about where it's being manufactured. And as I mentioned earlier, around the impact at the end of its life cycle, can it continually be maintained and updated? And if not, what is the implications of the end of life disposal of that product? So just before I hand over to Louise, last week at the Gofford conference, Louise and I bumped into Carl Thomas, who is the procurement reform stakeholder and policy lead at Welsh Government. And he's very much at the forefront of the multiple procurement notes that come out of Welsh Government, trying to basically drive innovation and new ways of procuring in Wales. We asked him if he could give us some type of quote that for him would sort of capture what the link is between procurement and net zero. And he said this, so procurement is one of the most important levers available to deliver our ambition for a net zero public sector in Wales by 2030. So that's ambitious in itself. Socially responsible approaches to procurement can support a green recovery and can help us build the modern infrastructure we need to get net zero. And finally, the Welsh Government are committed to working with partners across Wales, including SMEs and VCSEs, which are the voluntary councils, to develop a modern and sustainable approach to procurement. And the legislative changes being introduced through the Procurement Act 2023 and the Welsh Government Social Partnership and Public Procurement Wales Act 2023 will provide an effective framework for procurement, which maximises opportunities to deliver social, environmental, economic and cultural outputs for Wales. So, I mean, it's brilliant to see that Welsh Government are so committed and really do see a very strong link between the way they procure and this opportunity to drive down carbon emissions in businesses across Wales. So I'm going to hand over to Louise now to go over some of the legislation in a little bit more detail.
So shall I share my screen? Is that the way forward? Yeah. You've disabled my screen sharing.
Oh, right. There we go.
Why not manage that yet? Okay. Okay, not that. this. Okay. Yeah. Slideshow. Okay, so that's us. So what I'm going to do now is to talk about those two acts that Carl has just mentioned, particularly. This is the Procurement Act, which is the UK-wide legislation, and that's where all the structure, all the rules, the regulation is. And then the Social Partnership and Public Procurement Act from Wales, and they sit together, and that sits on top of the Procurement Act really, and is the Welsh take on it, and the way in which the duties, the responsibilities of public procurers in Wales need to interpret the Act here in Wales. It also relates to the Wales Future Generations Act, because that's how they describe the social value. So social value is part of the Procurement Act. It's the important 10%, or it can be more if the commissioners wish. Whoop, sorry about that. To include social value at a higher level in their procurement process, more than 10%. Okay, so this is the legal framework that we're going to have a look at. It's new. It replaces the Public Contract Act that was in 2015. Here we go. Okay, so basically what this Procurement Act is doing is requiring the commissioners to embed social value in their procurement processes and their objectives right from the beginning. It's making procurement far more of a strategic activity, not just the procurement team, but at that strategic level in the local authorities or NHS or arms reach bodies that are required to use this act to procure their goods. What it also does then is describe the structure in which a fair process must be operated. So it describes exactly how we will use transparency as a key process to inform people well in advance so they can participate in this process. It builds in flexibility so that the commissioners can tailor what they're doing to the market. So they need to find out about the market, their local market, how to include it, and then tailor the process to that. And that is the innovation and the innovative side of this act, basically. Okay, so this is describes the life cycle from planning. First of all, the planning side of it. So as I've said, a strategic activity done at a higher level and fitting into the other strategic plans within an organisation. It requires people to plan their procurement pipeline in advance so that they can then have plenty of time to do all the consultation necessary, and also to plan how they're going to market the whole process. Then this stage that we've called define here. So they need to define the market, and that's all about this essential stage of pre-market consultation. So pre-procurement market consultation and evaluating, finding out what's out there, what might be possible. Because it's a recognition that, you know, a diverse group of people involved in the procurement chain, a diverse procurement chain is going to be more competitive and create greater social value. So the actual process itself, it's some new elements in there that gives it flexibility. It needs to be published at various points with various regulations around that, creating that transparency of who exactly is being awarded. And once the process has been awarded, then there's obligations on the commissioners then to manage the process after that. to make sure people are meeting the claims that they claimed in their tender organisations, and to do something about it if they don't. They also have to pay within 30 days, which is a real benefit. Okay, so how is this going to benefit small organisations and social enterprises? Okay, so actually within the Act itself, it states what the procurement objectives need to be. It needs to be, so your procurement process needs to provide value for money, maximum public benefit. They have to act with integrity. The Act is committing them to also regard the barriers for SMEs and social enterprises, and they must consider how to lower them. So that is something very specific for our sector that is then has to be in all procurement strategies for public procurers. They obviously have to plan their stakeholder engagement, their publications, and their transparency notices. Okay, the define stage. So this is all about pre-market engagement. That's an absolutely vital stage where basically we being social enterprises, I'm throwing my lot in with social enterprises. So the market needs to understand what is required, and the commissioners also need to understand the market. So that's the process, the two-sided process about understanding what's possible, and realizing that by including those local smaller players, you get far more competitive tenderings. The procedure. They're required to publish their requirements and procedures. So everything is far more transparent, or at least it's regulated. That's what the regulation now says. And instead of what used to happen is they used to have the most economically advantageous tender. It used to be abbreviated to MEAT, but now we have MAT, which is most advantageous tender. So it's a different emphasis on advantageous in its broadest sense, that will help, small business and social enterprises. There's two procedures that can be used to run tenders. So one is the open procedure, a straightforward procedure that is just lifted from the previous Act, but also this new competitive, flexible tendering process. And what this allows the commissioners to do is to adapt their process to their market. So from the initial market engagement, they will run a two-stage process, assess the organisations themselves, not the product that they're saying, selling, so that they can then just select a few organisations to go on to the second stage. And in that second stage, then they can then build their own process depending on what the market is. So for examples, the sort of tools they could use site visits, they could use supplier presentations, dialogues, even making a prototype, etc., negotiations. So whatever's appropriate to the market, they can then build that into their tendering process. And because they're describing, because it fits in with their objectives, and they've published exactly how they're doing that, that transparency, then it then becomes a fair process, and they can evidence that fairness. And that's the key part of this, in order to encourage commissioners to run a process that really includes and addresses barriers for local organisations. It must also seem to be fair for everybody. So the managing part of the processes, they have a minimum of 3 KPIs for a contract for a successful tender. And if you tender for an organisation, you get feedback. You'll find out why you weren't successful. You'll also find out what was part of the tender that was successful as well. So you find out not only why you weren't, but who was, and on what basis those decisions were made. and payment within 30 days instead of 60. That's useful. Okay, so the Public Procurement Act Wales sits on top of that process. That process is very much something that tries to provide a level playing field for all organisations, no matter how small or large, and reassure the commissioners that this is a fair way to go about tendering for all. But the Welsh Act then, the Public Procurement Act in Wales then describes the social value in terms of the well-being goals from the Future Generations Act. It provides the duty on public and arm's length bodies here in Wales, requiring them to have smaller lots and to encourage collaborative bidding, all stuff that could potentially really benefit those small local players. Yeah, okay, I'm going to realise I've taken quite a long thing. So this, the 10% that is specifically social value within the procurement contract. This is the type of things that you could be doing as a social enterprise in order to score highly on social value. So you could be doing environmental initiatives, cultural, educational initiatives, community, working with a third sector, etc. Those are the type of activities that you would then document what you're doing in order to score highly on the social value element of things. So this is a sort of a little picture of the sort of things that organisations might be doing and need to describe if for procuring. So for social, they might be connecting with their communities, increasing diversity, reducing inequalities in pay gaps, or working towards net zero in the environmental section, or in the economic section. They may be, you know, sort of employment opportunities and training, offering employees additional training opportunities, etc. So what the commissioner is required to do under the Welsh Act is see what legacy can be created through a contract. That's what they need to think about. You know, in the social value, what will be left behind after the contract ends. Okay, so the social value model then is a sort of a methodology, a pick a mix. So they'll choose, so the commissioner would choose themes and outcomes and criteria on which to award against that. Only the qualitative, they will only judge these on the basis of quality, the qualitative, that is the quality rather than the numbers. So the what and how of this sort of thing. So what I mean by this, you know, so for example, you might describe what and how you will train or support your staff, what or how you might raise awareness of environmental issues, what and how you might deliver net zero. And that benefits small social enterprises because rather than the number, a larger organisation may train a far larger number of people, but your description of what and how means you will then score more highly than the larger organisation if they're just talking about numbers. Yeah. Okay. And what this does is then fit into the normal procurement cycle that I described above. So it's not an additional model, it fits into it. Yeah. Okay, and that's my final slide on this bit. It's really new. So the Act only became law in April of this year. The digital platform in the UK and England is going live in November, and the statements, the Wales procurement policy statements in Wales is that there's an expectation on the commissioners to start running the procedure in line with the Act from January 2025. Okay, back over to you, Nicola, now, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was slightly longer than...
No, that's fine. Thank you very much, Louise. If you can unshare and then I can.
Yes. Sorry.
Okay, so back over to me, and just to focus a little bit more on social enterprise. I think certainly for me, one of the key things that Louise was talking about then, it is genuinely quality and not quantity, which I think is a real, really big, strong opportunity for the social enterprise sector, because the difference, obviously, I mean, I'm sure I'm talking to the converted. I don't need to tell you the genuine benefit that social enterprise has on people's lives. It's obviously trying to put that all down into paper, but if commissioners really do genuinely understand that, then hopefully social enterprise will be scoring higher than other small enterprises that maybe just, for example, sponsor the football team. So I think there is a real opportunity going forward. So just to look at social enterprise as an option to reduce carbon footprint, which was sort of the slant that we were asked to cover within this webinar. So for commissioners, social enterprises are obviously, they are local. So I've got Welsh, I mean, depending on the size of the organisation, they can either be covering a region or a local authority, but they can also be hyper-local. So you could, I think, we saw a presentation the other day from Powys, and they said that they had something like 4,000 small organisations within Powys. So actually, yes, you can actually get sort of almost electoral wards, if not smaller, in terms of the areas that people cover. So social enterprises are there based on demand. They wouldn't exist if there wasn't a need and a reason for being. So actually they are there as a response to demand and need. So yes, in terms of as a commissioner being able to tap in to that local knowledge is potentially really powerful. If you have a social enterprise that is able to employ people, then that workforce is typically very local. And in terms of their environmental ethos, you generally get enterprises that either have the environment as a primary focus for the enterprise, or it can often be a secondary focus. So that could be, for example, in their own procurement and environmental and sustainability policies, in the way that they buy from other local enterprises or socially minded companies if social enterprise isn't available. And often these social enterprises have their own net zero initiatives and action plans, which is really what this additional project to Social Business Wales has been supporting enterprises with over the last sort of 9 to 12 months. In terms of added value, again, it goes part and parcel with their social mission and the fact that social enterprises reinvest their profits into the community. But it links very much to what Louise was saying in terms of what is the legacy in a procurement framework, what is the legacy that this contract will leave behind. And actually those social enterprises are there to stay. It's exactly like I said, they are created as a need, and they deliver first frontline community services, whether that be education or support. They contribute to regeneration. So actually, if it's, for example, a local authority that's commissioning some things, then actually it's a complete double whammy for them to be able to invest and support a local social enterprise. And gone are the days of service level agreements whereby a local authority part funds a social enterprise. But the very least they can do is give them the opportunity to deliver community services in a paid manner and have that type of relationship with them, because surely it is better that they are harnessing some of that collective intelligence that social enterprise has got, rather than trying to second guess what the communities want. And then I've just got a little asterisk which appears when people say Welsh, and actually, obviously that is certainly in food procurement in Wales, Welsh is a really, really high up the want list. But in terms of procurement, as long as these organisations have got a Welsh address, sometimes that's good enough for a tender. So I think the types of conversations that enterprises need to be having with commissioners is challenging and pushing them to do better than that. It isn't just about an address. One of an organisation that's absolutely fantastic and very pivotal in trying to get more Welsh produce into onto the public plate in Wales is Caffael. But I do know for a fact that their total amount of Welsh produce, even though they're a Welsh company, is still only 12%. And they are working very hard to get that higher. But actually, from a commissioner's point of view, sometimes you need to challenge what do they really mean by Welsh. So procurement as a whole, for a social enterprise, it does offer barriers, but it equally offers opportunities. It's definitely a barrier for a social enterprise to get known by the procuring authorities. It takes time to get into the contract, and that can be through a variety of avenues. It can either be potentially as a prime contractor or a subcontractor working with the prime contractor, but it could also be within the supply chain. So actually, when a tender opportunity comes out, it isn't as clear cut as it could be, because actually, if you start to dissect that supply chain, there is almost always going to be an opportunity for a social enterprise at some point. And I'll come on to talk about that in my next slide. But a real barrier for social enterprise is their track record, because actually these organisations are spending a lot of money and they are really risk adverse. So by not having a track record potentially in something, it can be a real barrier. But then it's kind of like jobs. How do you get that experience without having that contract in the first place? So again, I've got a couple of suggestions on the next slide. In terms of the opportunities, the time is definitely right. I mean, like I said, I've been doing bits on procurement. Actually, on another slide, I've got 2012 mentioned, because actually that's really when I started looking in detail at procurement, and have been sort of working on and off in it. But actually, this is a real leap forward in terms of the Social Partnership and Public Procurement Act. When that starts to come into force. And you never know, maybe it could be a small silver lining for the sector as a result of Brexit, because obviously we've had to completely revolutionise and change our procurement practices based on moving away from the OJU system, which was more in line with Europe in the past. Social value being at 10%, a lot of good procurement always has been at roughly 10% within a contract. But it's great to actually see it stipulated 100% within the new Act. And hopefully with this price versus quality weighting, if more of it's going to be about quality and less of it about price, then it's only ever going to be a positive. So how to talk to commissioners? I mean, first off, it's quite a simple question, but actually, what are you selling as a social enterprise? And the answer and the difficulty to this that I always had when selling my social enterprises was technically it could be anything, because these enterprises are set up to help something or do something in the community. So my example earlier was employing disabled people, and actually that was all we cared about. We could be packing soap or making furniture frames, or I don't know, it could literally be anything as long as it created those job outcomes. And that is something that's really difficult to be able to convey to commissioners. And I'm sure there are social enterprises that wouldn't necessarily be that open-minded about what they do, but actually, as long as you stay within that mission and you don't have mission drift, if there is an opportunity for a long-term sustainable income that could provide training opportunities, or but at the end of the day, it can provide a profit that can be reinvested into what that enterprise really wants to do, then in some ways, these opportunities must be looked at really carefully by any boards on social enterprises to work out whether that's a good thing or whether it would be slightly outside the remit of the enterprise. So in terms of talking to a commissioner, you definitely need to do your research. There's a lot of information on places like Celta Wales to look at past tenders that these companies have gone for or have advertised. And you can find information on the award notices to see who they've contracted in the past. There's also a lot of opportunities just from day-to-day life, and certainly where it comes to things like housing associations, you can see who their contractors are, who might be offering their building maintenance or ground maintenance based on the branding on the vans. It would be really helpful to talk to commissioners and say that we want to understand what contracts you've got coming up. This opportunity for them to put out prior information notices is really helpful, but actually just having conversations with enterprises to know that maybe there's a painting and decorating contract coming up or something. So you can start to put your ducks in a row and work out whether that's an opportunity that could be a good fit for your organisation. But you have to do this early because procurement rules mean that they can't have conversations once the tender has been released. You can ask them questions after that point, but they have to publish the answer to that question. So if you want to have a more organic exploratory conversation, then it really does need to be early. Definitely talk to them widely about their SME-friendly procurement approach. And it sounds like that's going to have to slightly be revolutionized based on the introductory of the new Act. There is an opportunity as well for social enterprises to support with co-production of local services. So if you know, for example, that a council is going to be putting out a contract for day services, then if you're an enterprise that's well connected with the cohorts and the potential users of those services, then offer an introduction, and that in itself can be a way to get into contracts. Another approach is via talking to the chief exec officer, because whilst procurements tend to be a very bottom-up approach, actually, if you can get a CEO or a director within that organisation that really believes in what you do, then they absolutely will find a way to get you into a contract somewhere. It can be really helpful to have a one-pager just to give to document some of your social impact, because if you're having a conversation with the CEO, it would be useful for them to have bits of paper that they can share with the rest of their colleagues. And I'll show you a very brief example in a minute. Definitely talk to the supply chain. Even if the commissioners can't help you directly, there's no reason why you couldn't be a subcontractor potentially or a supplier. So Menter Institute for the Blind that I used to work for, we put together kitchen units when they were doing their Welsh Housing Quality Standard refurbishment for Merthyr Valley homes. And that was a really good opportunity. It created a number of jobs within the organisation, and but we weren't able to be in the main supply chain. So by being a supplier, it was a really good opportunity. There's also definitely opportunities to run pilots, and this links back to the risk management, because actually if they can offer something to you that's a below threshold pilot, and if it can be dubbed as a pilot, for example, for grounds maintenance, then that's a great way to start to generate the trust with them and the track record. And they are, as I've mentioned before, unfortunately, a lot of formal procurements have to ask for absolutely the highest standards of risk management. So whilst I was with Wales and West Housing, we had a contract to build a new extra care scheme up in Newtown, and there was an opportunity for doing the landscaping and then the grounds maintenance contract after that. And as the social enterprise officer, I tried to get the social enterprise involved in that. But and they were meant to be a subcontractor of the prime, but actually it turned out, even though I walked them through the process, it was completely impossible for them to become a subcontractor for the development company, because they required something like £10 million insurance. They required a whole swathe of different policies and procedures that no social enterprise would generally have, potentially even environmental accreditations. So actually what happened there was we just ended up taking that whole grounds maintenance and landscaping part out of the contract in the end, and awarding that to the social enterprise directly. But there's a lot of commissioners that wouldn't do something like that, because that greatly increases the risk. Not only does it just double the contract management perspective of that part of the contract. So the last slide from me now, just going back to Merthyr Institute for the Blind, this was the type of thing that I put together in terms of a way of emailing it to commissioners, of starting to sort of as a follow-up conversation, maybe from an initial LinkedIn contact or an email. But actually it just broke down the social, economic, workplace and environmental credentials of that organisation. And it probably took me 2 or 3 days to put this together to try and get some of these stats. But looking at the type of people that we were helping, looking at our accreditations of where our workforce lives and the types of money that we are investing and generating with that in that economy, it just is a really cheap and easy way to put together some headline figures that can help instead of just it being you turning up and trying to have this conversation maybe at a Meet the Buyer event. It's something to put in their hand and say, look, go away, have a look at this, and then let's get a conversation going. Right, that's it from me. Back over to Louise for a couple very, very quick examples. Or example.
Does it, Nick? Yeah, Nick, does it make sense now to do some questions really, rather than, you know, that's more other countries' examples, because we have only got about 8 minutes left of the
Yeah,
6
maybe
minutes
you
left
could
of the.
circulate them after.
Yeah,
If you can put a paragraph or two together.
Yeah, sure. Because it feels like if I attempt to go through that list, there won't be any time for questions or discussions here.
Yes. Well, I think that's a good point now then. Okay, so are there any questions? Again, please don't feel under pressure. Probably lots of information. Or, I mean, was there anything that you didn't hear that you wanted to have covered today?
I mean, so I'm very new to the whole thing, but it was really interesting, and it's nice to see the initiative being taken by the government and organisations to implement all of these things, because, like you said, social enterprises reinvest back into the community and like projects within that, and it's yeah, it kind of gives you a bit of optimism about the way things are moving forward. So it was just, yeah, from that perspective, really interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah. And yeah, I found because obviously working with sort of food producers within RCT, the ones that are at least part of our network aren't necessarily big enough. Because I was speaking to the procurement team and they said that they did split down the procurement lots into smaller bids to encourage some more local, smaller suppliers. But even then, they didn't get much uptake from it. And I think because even smaller bids were still out of reach of some of the smaller people, sort of suppliers that we do have within RCT, or social enterprises that do want to get onto the ladder. So I'm really interested in the collaborative bidding. So I wondered if any of those examples that Louise is going to send out includes examples of how collaborative bidding works and what's the best way, or anything like that, or just if you knew any more about collaborative bidding.
I don't. They're too high level, the examples of these. So one's the European Union one, you know, a project at that level. I think probably the one that most likely is doing that is you know, what's it called now? The Common Market in Philadelphia, because quite often these examples, what they're doing is working under an umbrella of strategic aim, of strategic guidance, like for instance the Food Nation Act in Scotland. You know, that's that high level strategic vision for the whole nation, and then the plans that sit under that. That doesn't happen in America, just like it hasn't quite happened in Wales yet. So the common market in Philadelphia is this huge, great big intermediary. So what they'll be doing is they act as a hub and collate supplies, produce from all sorts of different local suppliers to then feed into it. So yes, that would certainly be a good example to describe that. Yeah.
They're sort of like a social wholesaler in a way, sort of a local wholesaler.
Yeah.
So, you know, they collect it all. And okay, yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
I mean, Business Wales did used to be able to help develop consortia and look at bidding, but I'm not sure they've got the capacity to do so anymore. There probably would be support within Social Business Wales if it was a group of social enterprises, because they could potentially form a new entity to tender for a bid. I'm just trying to think. I mean, there's work we're doing within our Backing Local Firms Fund bid is working with SME growers around, we're in collaboration with the Veg into Schools project that you might have heard of. Yeah, we're providing tools for those growers. So part of what we're looking at is things like collaboration agreements, and all of the tools that we create as a result of the project will be available by the end. And so getting, small scale growers working together. I'm just trying to think if I can actually think of any examples. I mean, there was work done by Social Farms and Gardens around the procurement food hubs as well. And again, that was similar, collating different, lots of food from different suppliers. But it's certainly for food procurement, it's knowing what they want in the future so people can grow, because it's exactly the same. It's almost the same as what I was saying. Tell us what you've got coming up. But for growers, it's almost like give us a retainer of up to 5 years where we can start to upscale. We know we can meet this demand, but we just can't do it next year. And the problem is, by not being able to meet that demand in year one, they go elsewhere, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
I think some procurement work along those lines is being done by Emma Oliver, a farmer herself on the Gower. So she's looking at putting together a consortium of Gower farmers for procuring into short supply chains in the Swansea area.
Fab.
It feels like the new act is great, and it is really, you know, setting that much fairer, wider benefits agenda. However, what this does mean is that there's going to be more work for the commissioning authorities, you know, the procurement teams, and if they're running in local authorities, you know, the challenge is to find the resource to do it differently, to meet all these objectives. So what actually happens on the ground would be interesting to watch, see how much of, you know, this aspiration actually comes into practice.
That's great. I think that's a very good point to finish on. I think if Louise gets a sec, she'll pop those case studies together and we can email them out. And then if Hannah and Rhiannon, if you've got any further questions or you'd like any signposting either to Social Business Wales or any of the outputs from our Backing Local Firms Fund project, then just ask.
Will do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
very much. Ta-ra.
Bye-bye.